Hajime! Welcome back to Comic-Jutsu. JT McRoberts here, and today I'm going to be your shogun of storytelling as I walk you through another edition of Superhero Spotlight. And once again, we're going to take a look at the mighty Namor of Atlantis, also known as Prince Namor, also known as Namor the Sub-Mariner, most recently brought to life on the screen for Wakanda Forever, which I have still not seen, but in honor of keeping the spirit of the original Prince Namor alive before he gets retconned out of existence by the MCU, we're going to take a look back at one of my favorite iterations of Namor in the comic books. Eagle-eyed denizens of the comic book dojo will point out the little nick on the cover of my Namor comic. This is the original copy, which I bought off the shelf. I do believe I purchased it at the local comic shop in town at the time. I was living in a very small rural town in North Kakalaki, and they actually had a comic shop for a short period of time. That shop went out of business. There were no comics in the county for a long, long time, and over the past 10 years, another shop has sprouted up and taken root there. And yeah, comics came back to town. But you'll notice the nick there caused by one of my cats who got the cover. Normally you'll see a nick or two across the top, but this one must have been laying flat and he ran over and sunk a claw into it. But that is the price one has to pay if you mix felines and comic books. Okay, today we're looking at Namor the Sub-Mariner, written and illustrated by the one and only John Byrne. This was, I suppose, John Byrne's third creative project after he returned from his historic run over at DC, where he rebooted Superman for the modern age. And at the time, John Byrne had kind of become the go-to man for rebooting into the modern age and essentially adding, all of the materialistic elements of the 80s into comic books as a way of updating it. It was, and he even goes on to say as much in this article in Marvel Age in that having lots and lots and lots of money is basically a superpower. So he started to imbue a lot of the villains or characters that he dealt with during this late 80s, early 90s run of comics. He started to imbue them all with the superpower of being super rich, believe it or not. I love this cover image for Marvel Age. Namor in the suit. He's got the pencil-thin cigarette holder there. And I love the image, but I had to think about it for a moment. And I'm like, when did Namor ever smoke? He essentially lived all of his life underwater, so that would be pretty difficult. But I do kind of like the idea of his developing a vice that he picked up from his human half and from his interactions with the surface world, and one that he can only indulge in while he is above water, obviously. So there's a neat little article in here previewing Byrne's upcoming run. After Byrne returned from DC, he started working on She-Hulk and the West Coast Avengers, which later became Avengers West Coast. And then he picked up Namor. This is a really interesting article in that Byrne basically gives away the plot for the entire first year of this series, and a lot of the specifics of probably the first 7 or so issues of the upcoming series. And I think this was released at about the time that the first issue came out. So the first issue actually has an April 1990 date on it, but it hit the shelves in February of 1990. One of the things Byrne talks about is drawing more inspiration from Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's version of Submariner, because he first encountered him in the pages of Fantastic Four, and that's what he was more familiar with, rather than the Bill Everett iteration. Bill Everett, of course, being the creator of Namor of Atlantis. He has an interesting line here that his original elevator pitch was, "The thrust is Donald Trump with wings on his heels." Boy, has that particular sentence become much more loaded in the intervening decades. You could use that depending upon one's leanings as either a superhero pitch or a supervillain pitch today. So, scary thought. But anyway, so he basically talks about his entire pitch for this, about the need to introduce rivals in a business sense, with Desmond and Phoebe Mars, the heads of the rival Mars Inc. Mars with two R's, that is, because it's much cooler that way. He mentions all the guest stars that he wants to hotshot this series with: Captain America, the Human Torch, Iron Man. He talks about bringing in elements from the Invaders, feuding with Doctor Doom if it goes long enough, so on and so forth. Oh, actually, right here he says the first time that he saw Bill Everett's Sub-Mariner was in an issue of Jim Stranko's The History of Comics, where there's an illustration of the Sub-Mariner punching the original android Human Torch, that is. Now, we are probably going to look at Stranko's History of Comics in a future episode of Rarities, so be on the lookout for that. So anyway, this was just an interesting little 4-page article wherein he basically gives away the thrust of the entire series. But at the time, Byrne had really kind of mastered the art of making things seem cinematic. I don't know if he took his cue from watching, the 1978 version of Superman, where Richard Donner pushed for believability and what he called verisimilitude. It seemed like Byrne really applied a lot of those. Let's make this more believable in the terms of what are the real physics behind this, what works, what doesn't. Let's try to explain away some of the idiosyncrasies with the character over the years. He does mention in the Marvel Age article that the Sub-Mariner had been characterized wildly different just depending upon his appearances, because for a long time he didn't have a steady monthly book that he appeared in. This book is coming on the heels of a long Namor run in the Avengers, where I do believe at the time that Atlantis was destroyed or the people were relocated or something to that effect, and Namor was trying to find his people again. So he's a little bit lost without them. In this premiere issue of Namor, we see Byrne's attempt to ground him in reality by the introduction of Caleb and Carrie Alexander, who are two marine biologists who have essentially dedicated their lives to studying and hopefully one day helping Namor the Sub-Mariner. And this whole first issue lays out that entire premise. And honestly, this would make a really great jumping off point for a series of movies in the MCU. Like if Namor was actually going to get his own, solo movie, though I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon because of complicated rights issues. But if he was going to have his own solo film, I mean, this is the perfect concept to go with, because Caleb and Carrie find the Sub-Mariner in the South Pacific, where he's on a rampage, just destroying this poor island. He doesn't really have a reason for it. He's just mad, and he's insulted by the impunity of the natives and what have you. So he destroys their idols and does damage to their village, and literally rips their totem from the ground and just swings it at them. I mean, it's total chaos. And then he starts hallucinating here. First he sees Lady Dorma, then Marina from Byrne's Alpha Flight, and he doesn't realize that he's actually having hallucinations, that he's really talking to Carrie and Caleb, the Alexanders, who wind up helping him. And he shows him this little machine that helps him correct the quote unquote blood imbalance. I mean, it sounds scientific enough that it makes sense. The Alexanders go on to explain that Namor, it's not his fault for these emotional swings, that is caused by this imbalance in his blood as a result of his being a mutant born of an undersea race and an above world race. So he's been having problems because of that. And this is a really great first issue. It's actually probably the single best issue of this entire run. But the way that it sets things up and helps turn Namor back into a direct hero rather than, this chaotic anti-hero that could just go in any direction. And it does a good job in doing so. Here you have a little flashback to when Caleb was younger and he was reading about the exploits of the invaders and Namor and the original Human Torch and Captain America and what have you. And he tells the story of not paying attention and riding his bicycle out on the pier and plopping into the water. And not only does he ride off the pier, fall into the water, but his bicycle is weighing him down. It's actually caught in his pants leg. So the notion is that he's just going to get pulled, deeper and deeper into the water until he drowns. But little does he know, he's saved by a rather fortuitously timed Namor of Atlantis, who swoops the boy up out of the water along with his bicycle, and he survives to become the older Caleb as we see him. But he says he goes home that day, gets rid of his bicycle, and decides to get a book on marine biology instead, and that's what began his path to becoming a marine biologist. So they help him, he clears his head, and then boom, here in Prologue 1, they call it Prologue 1 instead of Epilogue, because even though it's an epilogue for this particular issue 1, it's a prologue for the greater series to come, and it shows how Namor is going to use his wealth to become super wealthy and to gain the modern age power of super wealth as defined by John Byrne, as illustrated best by Wilson Fisk, the Kingpin, and of course Lex Luthor. He brings up lost pirate treasure filled with Spanish doubloons and gems. There you go. And he says basically that we're going to start a business and you're going to be my public face for it, Caleb and Carrie. It's a great setup. Prologue 2, or perhaps Epilogue 2, introduces the Mars twins and the Mars Corporation. And you see Phoebe and Desmond as the business antagonists for Sub-Mariner. And it's all set up right here in this first issue. Now, I will say, one of the great problems with grounding everything in reality is you'll immediately lose a lot of the fantastic elements. So here, instead of seeing some kind of fantastic otherworldly being, we have business people, which, as we know, they are one of the some of the least imposing and the least threatening type adversaries that one can have, especially on the screen. I mean, they work a little bit better when written well and buried behind and beneath layers of mysteries, wrapped in enigmas, hidden inside of riddles. But when you show their face out in the cold open like this, they become, humans that are not dangerous. They pose very little threat to someone like the Sub-Mariner. With just a flick of his hand could easily kill either one of them and just fly away to the bottom of the ocean. But in keeping with the premise of wealth as a superpower, you have to have one super wealthy villain to go up against our now super wealthy hero, or anti-hero if you prefer, in one Namor the Sub-Mariner. So I never did find which issue this particular image came from. But if you're a fan of Byrne's run on Alpha Flight, I mean, it's probably most similar to that in that it introduces and uses a few minor villains that are just good for a few fights. I mean, Byrne really does his monthly storytelling vibe on here. I mean, you can tell that he has things in plan for the long run. But every story, the way it's written, it's kind of treated at the end of the book is kind of treated as an act break almost. You know, he leads you up to that final cliffhanger. Boom. And then they'll pick up with the next issue, and you want to pick up from that great cliffhanger, but then it might have like a slight twist on it, where it's not exactly what you saw. In keeping, I guess, with the classic cliffhanger serials, where one would end with the hero stuck on the train as it goes off the cliff, and then the next one would begin with the train going off the cliff, but the hero, leaping out to the side. This is pretty much the same thing. So, it's standard John Byrne storytelling for the most part. He had mastered his art style by this point, and I don't want to say he's going through the motions. I mean, he's clearly having fun with some of these stories, but when he completely takes over the art, things start to change, and not necessarily for the better. At some point here, he implements this heavy use of zips through the series, and I just never really cared for it. I mean, it looks a bit muddy. Maybe it's just because of the coloring in this series, and that mixed with the low quality in the paper. It just makes it look muddy. It makes the inking look messy and indistinct. I mean, now mind you, I mean, it's all still John Byrne. It's still functionally John Byrne. It's still anatomically correct. The physics are very sound. It's exciting when it needs to be. It's dynamic when it needs to be. But there's not quite a challenge. I mean, look at this. You see what appears to be a normal Namorita. We know this is Namorita, but just in looking at it, the only extraordinary thing about her is the fact that she's flying. Everything else has been stripped away, and she's just flying from the city. So you're losing that kind of the four element, the four color, anything goes kind of possibilities of the Marvel universe. As having such as having Iron Man, appear in his exoskeleton, but everything else has been kind of watered down and made a little bit too literal, to the point where the stories themselves start to get confined by reality. But they work for a year or two for a run of a story, for the run of a book. You can deal with a few perhaps socially relevant themes, such as pollution and environmental destruction and whatnot. Here you see dealing with pollution of the water, that sort of thing. But anyway, Byrne properly hotshots the series, introducing either fun villains or fun guest stars, and he eventually starts to really hit his stride as he has fun with just going nuts on the second half of this. Here he foreshadows the return of the Invaders villains. These are the agents of the Axis agents, or whatever they're called, the Axis of Evil. And here in this opening sequence for issue 6, we see what's actually setting up issues 11 and 12. He learned his long-term storytelling from working with Chris Claremont on Uncanny X-Men, and he really gained his chops on that series over time. So he knows how to drop a page or two in to foreshadow something that's going to pop up, several months later. But here's a little bit of an example of what I mean by losing the wonder. Like, I remember seeing these books on the shelf, And I didn't buy them. I just thought, okay, the fashion looks good. It's very 80s. It's very early 90s fashion. It's believable in that sense. In that sense, it's a little time capsule, even if you will. But it's just not a fantastic looking design. It's just, this regular looking female in nice clothing, and she has a couple razor blades. In no way, shape, or form do we feel that she should be any sort of threat for our Namor of Atlantis. But some that we know are threats are the Axis agents, the agents of evil, whatever they're called. I don't know if they actually give them a name, the Axis super soldiers. But I love that they have this little half flashback issue, half news story of the agent Axis, the Axis agents seeking their revenge against Namor of Atlantis. So anyway, maybe we'll break those stories down a little bit later down the road. But I like the way that things wind through this series. Great guest stars. They decided to take it to great guest locations, such as when Namor has to go to the Savage Land. And they used the entire series to reintroduce Iron Fist, which is one of John Byrne's earliest drawing assignments from his time at Marvel. And rather than let Iron Fist be killed and remain deceased in such an ignominious fashion as he was killed, Byrne takes steps to correct that and bring him back into Marvel continuity. And it actually succeeded. At the time, I didn't take it very seriously, but it did result in Danny Rand and Iron Fist returning to Marvel continuity. So kudos to Byrne for that. And all in all, it is a fun run. Here you can see at the end, again, hot-shotted with Wolverine. And then the finale of that 2-year run as they go up against Master Khan from the Iron Fist mythos. There you have it. There's a little look at the John Byrne run of Namor the Sub-Mariner. I think it would make a great launching point for a solo MCU Namor series. It's probably not going to happen, especially now that his characterization has been changed so much. But, let me know what you think down in the comments. Is there another iteration of Namor out there that would make for a better ongoing series about Namor? Or would this indeed serve as the perfect springboard to launch him into the modern age? I sure think so. Anyway, thanks for watching. Comment, like, subscribe. Tell your friends about the video. Thanks for watching, denizens. As you were. Mate!